Please pray with me. O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So I spent the better part of this last week in Nebraska with the bishop and on some other projects. So this sermon was done about Tuesday, and I got a chance to look at it about 6:30 this morning. So we're just going to roll with this and see how this goes. My father-in-law, when he was alive, he's been gone now for, 21 years. But he had a funny saying, don't be a do-gooder. And it was one of those deals, he really didn't mean that, he was just being funny, but he was a counselor at the disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth for years and years and years. And so he had become a little cynical, I think it's fair to say, because of his dealings with some of the prisoners there. And so that was just kind of his shtick. Don't be a do-gooder. But it reminds me of a funny song. Actually, it's a very deep song of one of my favorite musicals, Wicked. If you've ever seen this is Elphaba, and for those of you who are more familiar with The Wizard of Oz, this is the Wicked Witch of the West. And Elphaba has a song in there, "No good deed goes unpunished." And she sings this. It's a movie part of the show. It's when she's tried to do everything right. She's tried to help the animals. She's tried to help the people. She's tried to help folks understand the importance of caring and loving each other and getting along, and specifically preserving these animals that could talk at one time, but now they can't. And it all blows up. So not only is she now the awkward teenager who happens to be green, but now she also is an outcast because she tries to do the right thing. No good deed goes unpunished is totally the antithesis, right, of what we are taught as Christians. And primarily when we think about how are we supposed to treat other people, one of the parables that we think about is the Good Samaritan. We're going to talk about that story today, and we're going to repeat a lot of information that you are already well aware of. And so we're going to go quickly through that. Where I want to spend our time is taking a look at how that story reflects on us today in 21st century America, in Lawrence, Kansas, at the corner of 4th and Elm Street. But first, what is a parable? So a parable is pretty simply, it's a story. It's a story that has a deeper meaning. It's a story that teaches. It's a story that provides us with some deep theological or spiritual information or a lesson. And Jesus taught with parables a lot. And there's two primary reasons. Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. First was for the people. You got to keep in mind what the society was like in Jesus' time. They did not have tremendous bookstores and libraries. This was an oral community. The reason the Bible repeats so much is because it was written down after a lot of people had to continually repeat things for everyone to remember it. And so Jesus told stories and parables because it helped people understand what he was trying to teach them. He always used everyday situations and circumstances. And you'll see where the Good Samaritan comes in that in just a minute. But think about it. When you read parables, Jesus talks a lot about farming. We can relate to that in the Midwest. But his followers, his listeners could have understood that as well. And because of that oral history and tradition, we have some tremendous stories in our Bible that may have been lost to time if it was supposed to be written down, because it just wouldn't have happened for many, many years. Think about it. The story of Noah, Moses, King David, all the judges that happened in between there, all the prophets. Those were all people whose stories were told over and over and over again many years before they were written down. A lot of our Old Testament wasn't written until the people were in exile, 500 or more years after those things took place. So that's the first reason. The second reason Jesus taught with parables was because, let's just face it, Jesus had style. Jesus liked to entertain because he understood that if he told a story, people would understand it way better than if he stood there preaching. Because who did the preaching? It was the people in the temple. Who did Jesus really take to task? He didn't take to task the poor. He didn't take to task the person that was struggling with their faith but was really trying. Jesus really only got harsh and took task to people who were in the temple leadership. As a matter of fact, he decided to use a couple of them in this story that we're going to talk about today. There are many other examples of parables. If you're not familiar with those, maybe you're familiar with fables, other stories that teach. As a kid, I remember distinctly it wasn't its own cartoon, but it was like mixed in with the other Saturday morning cartoons. They had Aesop's Fables. And I always kind of liked them. My cousin, I remember, didn't like them at all. He would kind of tune out and do other stuff, but I would actually sit there and listen to these. So you remember the tortoise and the hare? The race, okay? City Mouse and Country Mouse. I had to look that one up. I honestly did not remember that one, but King Midas and the Golden Touch, the goose that laid the golden egg, all these are familiar. The ant and the grasshopper. For my kids' generations, they got a much better story with that. If you remember the Bug's Life story that was told by Disney that is now a whole section of one of their theme parks, that's basically the story of the ant and the grasshopper. The point being, these things teach a lesson. And they teach a lesson, and we're going to read together the scriptural story, and then we're going to recap this for you and get into our discussion. Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37, and it goes like this. A legal expert stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to gain eternal life? Jesus replied, what is written in the law, and how do you interpret it? He responded, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said to him, you have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. But the legal expert wanted to prove that he was right, so he said to Jesus, and who exactly is my neighbor? Jesus replied, a man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He encountered thieves who stripped him naked, beat him up, and left him near death. Now it just so happened that a priest was also walking down the same road. When he saw the injured man, he crossed over to the other side of the road and went on his way. Likewise, a Levite came by that spot, saw the injured man and crossed over to the other side of the road and went on his way. A Samaritan who was on a journey came to where the man was, but when he saw him, he was moved with compassion. The Samaritan went with him and bandaged his wounds, tended them with oil and wine. Then he placed the wounded man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took 2 full days' worth of wages and gave them to the innkeeper. He said, take care of him, and when I return, I will pay you back for any additional costs. What do you think? Which one of these three was a neighbor to the man who encountered thieves? Then the legal expert said, the one who demonstrated mercy toward him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. May God add a blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of Scripture. We learned this story as a kid, right? I mean, this is one of the supreme Bible school stories. I remember hearing about it when I was a real little kid because I remember you all knew I grew up Baptist. I overcame it. But we had this big wall in our church, and it was one of those felt boards. And so you had the paper people that would stick to the felt board. I remember this story because I remember how dead the guy looked. When I was a little kid, I was like, wow, that just got my attention. There's a man traveling down a road that was probably this road. This is the road that Jesus probably had in mind. When I was in Israel in January of 2019, we went on a trip. We had finished in Jericho, and we were driving back up to Jerusalem where we were going to spend the remainder of our time. And we stopped in this really obscure area, and the guy that was our leader told us to get off the bus. We're going to walk a little bit, so we walk up into this area, and he explained that the story of the Good Samaritan that Jesus told was he was probably preaching to people on the other side of a hill that is just behind us in this photo. And so he probably had this area in mind. And if you look closely, there are hills that get pretty steep pretty fast. There are hundreds of caves carved into the sides of both of these hills. And it's where thieves would hang out. And it was famously where the zealots would camp out. Zealots were the people who were absolutely against the Roman occupation, and they were trying to plot an overthrow of the government. And in fact, Jesus took one of those zealots and made him a disciple. But in this area, this would have been the prime route to get from Jerusalem to Jericho in biblical times. And what's fascinating is unfortunately, you can't really see in this photo. I could never get a good photo with nobody in the picture. But this is narrow. You actually have to work to get around somebody who's laying on the side of the road. You can't just keep on walking and see like where Nate is. No, the farthest you can get on this path without it being really, really super rocky is about from me to this little table. So when it says cross to the other side, it means kind of like doing this and then marching on. That's the vision that I have when I hear this story now. Anyway, so we have a man who's been beaten, badly injured, and everything is taken from him. His dignity, because his clothes are taken. He's lost all the possessions, whatever he carried. One of the reasons that this area is so problematic is because Jerusalem and Jericho were the two kind of primary economic hubs in that area. And so if you were walking alone, it was easy for thieves to take you down. Simple reality is that whoever was walking between Jerusalem and Jericho probably either had something of worth, they had money, or they had something you could take and then sell. Pretty simple when you think about it. Anyway, there's a man lying there and he's been beaten badly, but there is hope because a priest is coming down the street. And surely the priest is going to help out. But the priest doesn't. Walks on the other side. And then a Levite comes along. Now Levites they trace their lineage all the way back to one of the sons of Jacob. But famously, this is where Moses and Aaron come from as well. And so these are the people who are the gatekeepers at the temple. They were the musicians at the temple. They were the judges for the Jewish people. They typically were the ones that were the craftsmen who decorated the temple and the synagogues of the day. But that person walks on by too. Two people who we think, man, if anybody's going to help this guy, it's going to be these folks. But they walk right on by. Some time passes, and finally a Samaritan comes by. Something that shouldn't get lost in this is just how far this Samaritan has already traveled. Because it's not like he was just walking from the same distance from Jerusalem. It says he was on a journey. Samaritans were not necessarily welcome in Jerusalem. And so he wasn't walking from Jerusalem to Jericho. He was probably walking from Samaria to somewhere south of Jericho, but this happened to be the route that he was taking. Now, we don't know that for sure, but if we look at the context of how Jesus was teaching this among people who would have known the history of the Samaritan people, and the people who would have known how Jews and Samaritans did not get along, it's pretty easy to figure out that this is a person who was traveling more than 100 miles from where he had been. So this is a multi-day journey. At best, a person can walk about 10 miles a day. So this person isn't just on a quick journey, but he sees this person, and yet he's the one who stops to help. Why is it so important to understand this person's a Samaritan? Because quite simply, Samaritans and Jews did not get along at all. Whose fault is it? I don't know if anybody's really to blame. When the northern kingdom was exiled in about 732 BC, give or take a couple of years, anybody who had any kind of talent, skill, money, they were hauled off. And as we've talked about before, very few of them were ever heard of again. Less than 5% of the Jewish people, ethnic Jews living in the world today, are from the northern tribes. They pretty much were wiped out. Or they intermarried to the point where their ethnicity is not pure, for lack of a better word to put it. When the people who were left, these were unskilled people, And Assyrians came back in and basically populated the area along with other people who came in and conquered what was left. And as a result, they had to intermarry. That was survival. And so the bloodline was not pure, like I said. It meant that when the people did kind of get back into a swing of things, and the people of Judah in the southern part, the southern kingdom got with them, these people were not allowed in the temple. And so they had to build their own temple. And in a twist of fate, the people in the southern kingdom didn't like that. They thought that was not at all kosher, because you're supposed to worship God in the temple in Jerusalem. So everything's against the Samaritan from a Jewish standpoint, and yet he's the one who stops. We learned that he uses oil and wine to treat the wounds. So he's now using his things of value to treat this man that he doesn't know. We also know that he bandages him up. He takes him, puts him on his own donkey, so now he's got to walk the rest of the route. I don't know what the pathways were like in the biblical times, but I can tell you, walking in the 21st century, even with good shoes on the path that we were on, the rocks are huge, they're sharp. It's not for people who have foot problems to walk on. What's the lesson here? Well, the legal expert is trying to trick Jesus. He wants Jesus to tell him, who does he not have to love? Who can he get away with mistreating? And by picking the Samaritan as the hero, Jesus basically says, there is no one that you're free from loving. You have to love everyone. His audience in that day and age would have completely understood that lesson. They wouldn't have liked it, but they got the lesson. So what I want to spend some time on here today is not necessarily the story that we already know, but the characters within the story and what they kind of show us in the 21st century. Because I think it's important for us to understand that this story still goes on every day. And there are days that we are part of the story and we are the Samaritan. And those are great days for us. But there are days when we are the person who's been beaten up. We're the one laying on the side of the road. Someone treated us badly. Someone harmed us in some way. Somebody took something from us. Some days we are the person on the side of the road. Imagine yourself in that position. What does it feel like? Have you ever been there? I have. You just feel like the weight of the world is on you, and there's nothing you can do about it. You are at the mercy of others. Unfortunately, some days we're the robbers. These days it's not so much all-out thievery, although it can be, but identity theft is the illustration I decided to use because that's the most prevalent in the United States today. I was listening to a podcast on my way back from Nebraska last night, and there was an amazing statistic that somebody shared. I think the podcast was from 2019, and at that point, there was a period of time where there was an identity theft in the United States once every 3 seconds. So, yeah. These are the folks that we encounter today, though. People who want something for nothing. They're just going to take it. And there's nothing we can do about it. Well, we can try to protect ourselves, but sometimes there's just nothing we can do. Bully tactics, coercion, things at the expense of others. Have you ever been in the role of the robber? At some point, all of us probably have. Not willingly, not on purpose. It may be months or years later that we realize, wow, I didn't treat that person very nicely. Or I took that from someone. Something to think about. Then we have the priests and the Levite. The priest and the Levite. And we are very quick to criticize them, aren't we? I mean, because these are the folks that we think are going to help this guy, and they just walk right on by. But we have to remember what their roles were. If they had approached a person who was dead, or a person who was bleeding, they would have been ceremonial unclean for at least 7 days. What if they had priestly and Levite duties in the temple within that 7-day time frame? they wouldn't have been able to have fulfilled their duties. So they decide that they're going to protect that job and leave this person on the side of the road. It's one person. I got bigger duties to fulfill. I've got a job to do. I've got to help at the temple. I've got to make sure that we do sacrifices the right way. Or the Levite's case, maybe he's got to be the gatekeeper for people to get into the temple. These are not bad people. They are leaders in their communities. The equivalent in today's world would be the bank CEO, the school board member, elected officials, business people, prominent folks. But these folks, the priest and the Levite, what do? They're more worried about their standing. They're more worried about their privilege, their place in society, than they are about helping someone who's near death. How many times do we turn a blind eye to someone who's struggling, who's hurting? How many times do we ask ourselves or tell ourselves that I really want to help, but I've got to protect this, whatever this is. Maybe it's a standing in a community. It's something that we have to remember. And unfortunately, all too often we as people find ourselves in the role of the priest and the Levite. Not because we want to, but because we just do. What we want to be is the Samaritan. We want to be the guy that pulls over to the side of the road and helps somebody jump their car, or change the flat tire, or buy diapers. That's the people we want to be. I think Jan Perry is serving as a great example this morning of the Samaritan. Gave up time with her great-grandchildren to help someone who needed it. I think Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said it the best, and I think this is it's the most profound, it's pretty simple, but I think this really gets to the bottom of the motivation between the people. Dr. King preached on this many times, and this is what he said. The priest and the Levite thought, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? The Samaritan thought, if I don't stop to help this man, what will happen to him? Did you notice the cause and effect in those two sentences? One's worried about themselves, one's worried about the other person. The reality for all of us, folks, is that we have been on a really, really tough road between Jerusalem and Jericho for about 20 months, haven't we? Between COVID-19, racial injustice that was put right in our faces because of cameras, and we couldn't ignore it anymore. People who don't have a place to live, food to eat, diapers for their kids. We've experienced it, and we continue down that road because, you know what? We live in a dangerous world. We live in a really tough world to navigate. We're exhausted. COVID-19 has made all of us tired. There's so much to remember and keep up to date on. And sometimes we can be fearful because of that. And when you think about it, that's really what happened to the priest and the Levite. They let fear get in the way. Fear of losing their station in society, or fear of not being able to fulfill whatever duties that they were going to be asked to do because they might have been unclean under the definition of the Mosaic Law. But the Samaritan said, you know what? This person was more important. And that's what Jesus was trying to teach these people around him. And then I think he's trying to teach us today in the 21st century. It's not easy being a Christian. It's not easy being a follower. Because to be a follower of Jesus means you don't cross to the other side of the road. Being a follower of Jesus means you walk up to the person in need of assistance. Whatever that assistance is and whoever that person is. And you do what you can. Now, it's important to note the Samaritan could not heal the man. He couldn't make him all better. He couldn't fix everything. He couldn't get back the possessions that were taken from him. All he could do was provide a place where he could heal and rest. And so he did what he could. And that's all Jesus asks of us, to do what we can. I pray that God will work through us to make that happen in the days ahead. Amen.